Shaw, how we feeling?
I'm feeling good. I'll tell you what, I feel devastated for Lions fans, guys. They were on the cusp of getting to their first Super Bowl, and unfortunately for them, it's going to be San Francisco going to another Super Bowl. And you mentioned it earlier, going to have the rematch of Super Bowl 54. So I know we got a lot to unpack today, but that's a tough one if you're a sports fan, particularly a Lions fan.
Yes, Lions fans. We might have one on the show. Good reference. Dustin Sweetelson, we say hi. How you feeling, big guy?
I feel like I'm supposed to come up to the top of the key with the ball, hand it off to you. You're supposed to do one of these maneuvers, wave everyone away, and the isolation offense is supposed to begin because someone on this show for months was talking about Dan Campbell and his decision-making and how in the end it would do the Detroit Lions in. And I think we need to let you just kind of vent and speak because I should be asking you, how are you doing today?
Why? What did Campbell do?
He was Dan Campbell. That's what he was. He stayed true to himself. He was himself the whole game. He did exactly what got him here, and that's why he's no longer playing football this year.
So the late game, Detroit beat San Francisco 34-31. Just the facts. I'm going to do this broadcast like I'm Irvin Magic Johnson on Twitter. I'm just going to give you facts. No emotion associated with it, big guy. But 34-31, so Detroit covers the number. San Francisco closed 7.5, 53.5 on the total. Obviously soars over the total, 64 points scored. Earlier in the day, you had Kansas City and Patrick Mahomes. Much will be discussed about Mahomes and his legacy as we get closer and closer to Super Bowl 58, a 17-10 winner over Jackson, we must discuss, and Baltimore. Baltimore ends up closing 5-44 on the total, so obviously an outright win for Kansas City, and easily under the 44. Amal Shaw, we'll start with you. We'll start with the late game and just the overview, your takeaway. Lions lose to San Francisco.
Look, I thought, we talked before we came on air about Ben Johnson and potential scenario with Washington, but what a play call and just overall level of execution you saw from the Lions in the first half, putting up 24 points. Guys, it was shocking that they look like they should have been the 7-point favorite in that football game as we got to the break. But, Patrick, when the decision on fourth down, and I know people will say it's a hindsight call, it's not. You're up by 14, 7 minutes to go. The Niners only got 3 points in their opening drive of the second half. I thought this was one of the easiest decisions I've ever seen for a team to take the 3 points. The decision to forego that, I thought really changed the game. And I was talking to a friend of mine this morning who attended the game. He said the air in the building changed completely, the atmosphere, when the stop came on fourth down. And then within about 3 minutes, you saw the game tied up, the touchdown, the Jahmyr Gibbs fumble and touchdown. And it just changed the whole dynamic. I thought if they went up 17, what you did was you took the game from 30 minutes remaining up by 17 to now 22 minutes and up by 17. Maximum 5 possessions remaining for San Francisco. You put a ton of game pressure on them, and their decision-making and their aggressiveness may have caused them to make a mistake and pretty much ended everything.
So that is one fourth down call. Did you have an issue with the second fourth down call with Campbell choosing not to tie up the game?
I did, because one of the other scenarios is you're in field goal range. We know Michael Badgley's got a strong leg. You have an opportunity to kick a field goal there, tie the game up. It puts pressure on San Francisco, and it does two things for me, Patrick. And number one, it keeps you within a one-score game, even if the Niners, as they did, go right down the field and score a touchdown, so you're still within 7 points. The other thing is, if you go down and you get a touchdown and you take the lead, San Francisco now has an additional down to work with, because then desperation sets in. You're down 4 points. You're going to go for it on fourth down in scenarios. I think San Francisco would have taken certain risk if they're trailing compared to if the game is tied. They would have played the game. They would have executed their game plan, but in a third down situation, they don't convert. They're going to punt the ball. You could get it back. You're relying on your defense to make a play. I didn't like that decision, and I understand the argument. People will say, well, he's done it all year long. You know what? My argument is this. You don't necessarily make decisions the same way you do in your 20s and you do in your 50s and your 60s. And I think that's the same thing. When you got closer on the cusp of knocking through that door and making history for the Lions and first time getting the Super Bowl, you needed to adjust what the time scoring situation called for.
Big guy, did the 49ers win that game last night, or did the Lions lose it?
The Lions lost it because they looked awesome. The script at the beginning was great. They were bullying the bullies. They had San Francisco on its heels. They showed how vulnerable they really are. And they, as Amal said, looked like the better team. The problem is there's a lot of coaches right now and teams for that in the NFL who don't know how to play with a lead. Playing with a lead is not the same as how you got the lead. You can't keep doing the same things you did to get the lead. You have to switch things up. The mentality has to change. And I don't have many issues with going for it during the regular season. It's a larger sample size. You're saying over the course of 17 games, we will be on the right side of this. And to the Lions' credit, 18 for 21 on 4th and 3 or less in opponent's territory during the season. That's 86%. That's what got them there. I just think the playoffs are a different animal. When things shorten up, when there's only so many opportunities to score points, you cannot walk away from those opportunities. And on top of it, when you have a lead, you can't walk away because you need to make it harder for a team like the 49ers to swim upstream coming back against you.
I don't expect you guys to know what the Detroit Lions hashtag is on social media, but I'll tell you, it's hashtag #OnePride. And I'll start my conversation about the Detroit Lions pridefully. All right, one pride. And the fact that the Detroit Lions were in the NFC Championship game, I'm 45 years old, that was incredible. So I walk away from it very prideful. And Dustin, you mentioned it. If you've been following along like Sharp Money for a while now, I've been trying to tell you, add into your handicapping, once Dan Campbell gets involved into the flow of a football game, he gets completely lost. Like, absolutely loses his mind. He did it many times last night, but he's done it many times over 3 seasons, and he just loses his bearings. That does not outweigh the benefit of Dan Campbell. Dan Campbell, we talked about it. In totality, what he's trying to do and what he's done successfully as the Detroit Lions head coach is he's built a culture. Okay? So you're just hoping that culture, that toughness, that grit that you constantly hear Dan Campbell espousing, you're hoping that that is enough to overcome the cost, which is in game, he loses his marbles. Okay? And we saw that last night. But I'm going to say this right now. I think, Dustin, you've known me long enough. I think you think that I've been sandbagging about Dan Campbell and calling him my coach and referencing the emotional intelligence that Jared Goff said he pertains to Dan Campbell and all this because he is a blue-collar, hard-nosed, kneecap type of guy. But I'm going to say this right now. Today is not the day to pile on Dan Campbell. Okay, this is not the day after what he did for the city of Detroit and the state of Michigan to pile on Dan Campbell. That is my coach. He's going to lose his offensive coordinator. We'll get to that. But Dan Campbell is and will be the Detroit Lions head coach. And I am hashtag #OnePride, proud of him and proud of the team. Now, you're up 21 on the road in the NFC Championship game. You'd like to win that football game. That is a historic meltdown in the second half. And frankly, the cost-benefit, a lot of those decisions that Dan Campbell made led to the unraveling of the Lions in the second half. But that's not it, because Brock Purdy, we should give credit to him. King Kyle threw up all over himself. You can't give Kyle Shanahan any credit. Anybody knows that. However, I will say this about Dan Campbell, and the one thing that I'm concerned about, because there is so much as far as identifying with being ballsy and identifying with being brazen, that I think there's a danger of that message kind of parlaying itself into an identity trap. And yesterday in the game, when we identify people on social media, they're trying to trap you. They're letting you know, here's who I want to be. This is the projection of who I hope people think I am. That is the definition of an identity trap. And right now, the Lions, if they're going to get over that hump, which is get to the Super Bowl for the first time in over 100 years, I think what the Lions need to do, and there has to be a self-regulation from Dan Campbell himself, because yesterday, that was the Lions' identity. They beat up the San Francisco 49ers. They pummeled them in the first half. They had an offensive coordinator that was performing a dance that Kyle Shanahan is supposed to do, but of course, Ben Johnson performed it perfectly. And then in the second half, you saw the contradiction. You saw the Dan Campbell that builds his team off of the identity of being tough and just smacking people in the mouth and having a bunch of athletes, and then it all fell apart because he got trapped in his own ballsy and brazen identity. We can argue whether or not, as Amal just did well, we can argue about the 4th down calls. The interesting part about arguing about the 4th down calls is you're going to have 60% on one side, 40% on the other side. We can argue about how they handled the late game and using the timeout. Actually, you can't argue that. He completely lost his brain and he threw up all over himself, but he had already gotten to that point. We can argue about the fourth down calls and whether or not it fits that identification of Dan Campbell, and it rightfully does. However, he needs to be very careful because moving forward, this is a team that can win a Super Bowl, but not if Dan Campbell falls into his own identity trap.
Go to VSiN.com/subscribe to become a VSiN Pro subscriber today.